The music faded into the hum of the summer night, but Violet could hear nothing beyond the sound of her own heartbeat. Austin was here. After 3 years, after all the distance, he was standing before her, familiar yet different. She had wanted this moment until Elena appeared, her hands slipping into his. "We're getting married after graduation," Elena said, her voice light and effortless. The air thickened. Violet's world, once filled with possibility, now felt impossibly small. And just like that, time unraveled, pulling her back to where it all began, to the final summer of high school, when love had been silent but never absent. The summer heat lingered in the hallways, thick with the scent of freshly waxed floors and the distant hum of conversations. It was the last summer of high school, an ending and a beginning intertwined. Violet walked through the corridors, fingers grazing the edge of her textbooks, her mind already half lost in the thought of leaving. College acceptance letters had been received, plans were set, and yet there was still something unresolved, something she hadn't named. Austin. He wasn't the loudest in class nor the most reckless. He wasn't the kind of boy who stole the spotlight. But somehow in the spaces between things, in the quiet moments when no one else was looking, he became someone she couldn't ignore. There were always those stolen glances, the ones that lingered half a second too long, the ones she pretended not to notice. Did he know? Did he feel the same? It was the way his hand would accidentally brush against hers when they passed each other books, the way he would pause just a little before answering her in class, as if measuring his words carefully. Sometimes, in the in-between moments of school life, when the bell had just rung but no one had left yet, when a teacher stepped out for a moment and the class filled with idle chatter, Violet would glance across the room and find Austin already looking at her. And in those fleeting seconds, she could almost hear the words neither of them dared to say. But neither of them ever spoke. Their world was filled with missed chances. The school dance, where she had expected, hoped, he would ask her, but he never did. The group projects, where they ended up together by chance, yet conversations never crossed beyond the boundaries of academics. The summer bonfire, where their friends laughed and music played and the stars burned bright above them, but still, nothing. Everyone else around them seemed oblivious. Their friends, Anna, whose voice always carried across the hallway, and Jeremy, who treated life like a stage, never noticed the way Violet and Austin's paths aligned just enough to be meaningful, but never enough to be certain. And so they played their roles, acting as though they were just classmates, just two people who happened to be in the same space at the same time. Until the last week of school. The day was filled with farewells, teachers wishing them luck, students signing yearbooks with hurried scrawls. Violet found herself standing at the edge of the school field, her fingers tightening around her pen as she debated whether to write something more than just a simple, "good luck." In his yearbook, Austin stood nearby, flipping through the pages of his own, nodding along as someone spoke to him. His expression unreadable, his presence, like always, calm, unshaken. She could have walked up to him. She could have said something, but the words never came. And so, when the final bell rang and the summer sun burned through the clouds, they walked away from each other, carrying their unspoken feelings into the lives waiting ahead. Violet stepped into the grand halls of the art school, the scent of paint and aged wood filling the air. Sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting golden streaks across canvases and half-finished sculptures. This was where she belonged, or at least, that's what she told herself. She threw herself into her work, letting colors and textures speak for emotions she couldn't quite name. The first year passed in a blur of late-night sketches, caffeine-fueled critiques, and endless discussions about composition and meaning. And yet, despite the vibrancy of her surroundings, there was always a lingering absence, a space she couldn't seem to fill, no matter how many brushstrokes she layered on the canvas. She tried dating. There were late-night walks along the river, laughter over shared cups of coffee, and moments that almost felt real. But something was always missing. She convinced herself it was normal, that love wasn't supposed to be a perfect fit, that she had simply idealized something that never was. But in the quiet moments, when she sat alone in the campus library, her pencil tracing lazy circles on the margin of her notebook, Austin's name would slip into her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake. Far away, Austin had stepped into a world that ran on numbers and logic, where success was calculated and emotions were best left at the door. His university campus was sleek and modern, a place where ambition thrived and uncertainty was seen as weakness. He adapted quickly, shedding the quiet introspection of his teenage years for sharp suits and sharper decisions. There was little time for nostalgia. The past was a distraction, and he had no intention of looking back. And then he met Elena. She was everything that made sense in his new world. Bold, charismatic. A woman who knew exactly what she wanted and wasn't afraid to reach for it. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable pull between them. Elena didn't believe in hesitation. When she laughed, it was loud and uninhibited. When she looked at him, it was with confidence, as if she had already decided how their story would unfold. She fit seamlessly into his life. The fancy networking events, the late-night study sessions fueled by caffeine and ambition, the whispered promises of a future filled with power and success. She didn't ask if he believed in love. She only asked if he believed in them. And for a while, he did. 3 years passed. Austin and Violet never spoke. Violet continued painting, continued searching for something she couldn't name. Austin continued building a life that looked perfect from the outside. And somewhere in between, the love they had never admitted to slipped further and further away. The air was thick with the warmth of late summer, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the park. The annual town festival had always been an event filled with nostalgia. Live music, laughter echoing through the streets, families gathering on the grass with picnic blankets. Violet never expected it to be the backdrop of a moment she thought would never come. She had only returned home for a brief visit, a few weeks to slow down, to let herself breathe outside the city's relentless pace. The festival was a tradition she had almost forgotten, a piece of her childhood she hadn't realized she missed. As she wandered past booths filled with handmade crafts and the smell of caramelized popcorn, she let herself sink into the familiarity of it all. And then, everything shifted. It happened in an instant. Her gaze lifted, and across the crowd, she saw him. Austin. For a moment, the world narrowed. The voices around her faded into a hum. He stood near the main stage, his profile illuminated by the string lights overhead. His hair was slightly shorter than she remembered, his posture more composed. He wasn't the boy she used to know. And yet, something about him was exactly the same. Her heart clenched in a way she hadn't prepared for. She should have turned away, should have kept walking, but instead she froze, trapped in the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. And then he looked up. Their eyes met across the distance. And in that instant, the past was no longer a memory. It was alive, breathing between them. Violet saw it in his expression, the flicker of recognition, the way his lips parted slightly as if he had forgotten how to breathe. 3 years had passed, and yet it felt like no time at all. He moved first, making his way toward her through the crowd. Every step sent a surge of adrenaline through her veins, but when he finally stood before her, when he smiled, a little hesitant, a little familiar, she found herself smiling back. Violet. His voice was steady, but she swore she could hear something deeper beneath it. Austin. Her own voice came out softer than she intended. Neither of them said more, not right away. Because what did you say after 3 years? After everything and nothing had changed? They started with small talk. A conversation about the festival, about how long they were both staying in town. The words were easy, but the energy between them was anything but. There were pauses where they both seemed to want to say more, moments where their eyes held a weight their voices didn't carry. And then the encounters continued. A few days later, they ran into each other at the cafe they had both frequented in high school. The day after that, it was the bookstore. And then it wasn't just coincidences anymore. It was seeking. They started meeting intentionally, long conversations over coffee, walks down familiar streets, memories slipping into their talks as if they had never stopped. It wasn't forced. It wasn't awkward. It was dangerously easy. Violet felt something shift inside her, something she had buried long ago. She wasn't sure when it happened, whether it was the way he listened so intently or the way he still had that quiet steadiness that made her feel safe. For the first time in years, she let herself wonder. What if? What if this was their second chance? What if they had only needed time to find their way back to each other? But before she could say anything, before she could even let herself hope, Elena appeared. It was at another town gathering, this time near the lake. Violet had arrived late, her mind still tangled in the conversation she and Austin had shared the night before. She hadn't even spotted him yet when she heard a voice, a woman's voice, laughing beside him. Her steps faltered. Elena, she was stunning, effortlessly elegant, even in the casual glow of the outdoor lights. She leaned into Austin as if she had always belonged there, her fingers casually slipping into his hand. And then he turned, his gaze locking onto Violet's. In that moment, everything shattered. The summer air had cooled, but Violet felt none of it. The distant sound of laughter and clinking glasses from the town gathering barely registered in her mind. Her eyes were locked on Austin and Elena, on the way Elena leaned in effortlessly, the way her hand rested lightly on his arm, as if she had done it 1,000 times before. And then she heard it. "We're getting married after graduation." Elena said it so casually, so easily, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Violet's breath hitched. She had known. Some part of her had always known that this would happen. Austin had never been hers to lose, and yet he had never felt so far away as he did in that moment. She forced herself to smile, to keep her expression unreadable. "That's great news, congratulations." Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears, light and controlled, as if she weren't standing on a breaking foundation. Austin's gaze flickered toward her then, a moment too long, a hesitation too deep. Did he notice? Did he sense the way the words had carved through her? It didn't matter. The night stretched on, and Violet played her part well. She laughed at the right moments, responded when spoken to, made conversation with people she barely registered. But inside, she was crumbling. Later that night, when she was alone in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in slow circles, she thought about all the things she had wanted to say to him. "I never stopped thinking about you. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had spoken back then? Would things have been different if I had told you the truth?" The words formed, lingered, and died before they ever had a chance to be spoken. The next day was the last of her summer in town. She found herself near the lake where they had spent so many childhood afternoons, the water still and quiet under the morning light. Austin was there. For a brief second, she thought about saying something, about letting it all spill out before it was too late. He turned to her then, eyes soft but unreadable. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made it hard to breathe. And yet, she said nothing. She only smiled. "Take care, Austin." His brows furrowed slightly as if there was something he wanted to ask, something he wanted to say. But before he could, she had already turned away. The wind carried the sound of her footsteps as she walked back to her car. She didn't look back. That evening, she packed her bags, boarded a train, and left. And this time, she swore she wouldn't look back again. The sound of clicking heels echoed across the grand hall, blending with the soft murmur of conversation and the delicate clinking of champagne glasses. Violet moved through the room with effortless grace, her eyes scanning the space, ensuring every detail was in place. The lighting perfect, the artwork displayed just right, the guests immersed in the atmosphere she had meticulously curated. At 27 years old, she had built a name for herself in the world of art exhibition planning. She no longer held the paintbrush but had found another way to stay close to what once defined her. Instead of creating art, she created spaces where others could share theirs. It was a different kind of fulfillment, one that allowed her to control the narrative instead of being consumed by it. It was in this world that she met Ethan. He was everything a woman like her was expected to want: successful, polished, driven. With a sharp mind for business and an undeniable presence, he commanded rooms the moment he stepped into them. People listened when he spoke, respected his vision, admired his ambition, and he admired her. At first, she wasn't sure if she was drawn to him or simply to the idea of him. He made sense in a way that love never had for her before. Predictable, stable, a future that didn't rely on unspoken feelings or painful nostalgia. He pursued her with the confidence of a man who always got what he wanted. Their relationship unfolded in calculated steps. First professional partners, then casual dates, then something more. There were no lingering glances, no uncertainty. He knew what he wanted, and maybe that was what she needed, or so she told herself. Across the country, Austin's life had taken a different path. His marriage to Elena, once so certain, had unraveled far quicker than he ever imagined. What had started as passion and ambition had turned into distance and disillusionment. They had built a life together, but not a love. In the end, their differences were too great, their expectations misaligned. 2 years in, they chose to end it. Divorce wasn't the painful part. It was what came after. Sophia, his daughter, became the center of his world. At 3 years old, she was small but fierce, a reminder that some things were still worth fighting for. For the first time in years, he didn't rush to fill the void. He spent a year rebuilding, not just his career, but himself. He worked, he learned how to be a father, he stayed away from anything that felt like distraction. And then, life made a decision for him. A new opportunity, a relocation, a fresh start in a city that was supposed to be nothing more than a practical move. But when he looked at the address of his new office, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Because, by some twist of fate, he was moving to the city where Violet now lived. The message arrived on a quiet afternoon. Austin. Hey, I heard you live here now. Want to catch up? Violet stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. A part of her had expected this, maybe even waited for it. Still, seeing his name on her phone after all these years felt like something pressing against an old wound, one she had long convinced herself had healed. She took a slow breath before replying. Violet, sure, let me know when. The coffee shop he suggested was small, tucked away in a quieter part of the city, the kind of place that felt like a secret only locals knew. When she arrived, Austin was already there, sitting by the window, fingers curled around a ceramic mug. She hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. When their eyes met, there was no grand moment, no cinematic rush of emotion. Just familiarity. Just something old and something new coexisting in the space between them. It's been a long time, he said as she slid into the seat across from him. Yeah, she agreed, and for a moment there was only the sound of coffee being poured behind the counter, of muted conversations around them. But then, the words came easily. Austin told her about the marriage that had started like a perfect plan and ended like an afterthought. How love, as it turned out, wasn't just about shared ambition, but about shared understanding. And he and Elena had none of that. How the only thing that had ever truly mattered in that relationship was Sophia, his daughter. Violet listened, the weight of his words settling somewhere deep inside her. Then she spoke about Ethan, the man who fit into her life the way she had always thought a partner should. Logical, stable, no chaos, no heartbreak, but also no deep, undeniable feeling. So you're happy? Austin asked, studying her. She hesitated. I should be. Austin didn't press further. They talked until their coffee went cold, until the afternoon light softened into early evening. And when they left, it wasn't with promises or expectations. Just a quiet understanding that they weren't strangers anymore. It started slowly after that. A message here and there. An invitation for coffee again. A dinner with mutual friends. They were just catching up. Just two people with shared history reconnecting. But then there were the moments in between. The way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. The way her breath hitched when his hand brushed against hers, even if only for a second. The way laughter between them felt effortless, like something they had never lost. The past wasn't gone. It was there, beneath the surface, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, so was something else. The rain drummed softly against the window, a rhythmic sound that filled the space between them. Violet sat across from Ethan in their usual restaurant, a sleek modern place he had always preferred, where the air smelled like expensive wine and conversations were meant to be composed. But there was nothing composed about the way he avoided her gaze. There's something we need to talk about. His voice was calm, as if he were negotiating a business deal, rather than ending a relationship. Violet set her glass down carefully. She had felt this coming, the emotional distance, the way he had started canceling plans, the way their conversations had shifted from we to I. But still, hearing the words left a strange hollowness inside her. "I've been offered a position in London. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Violet. I need to take it. And where do I fit into that?" She already knew the answer, but some foolish part of her still needed to hear it. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw like he was trying to soften the impact. "You don't." The finality of it settled over her like a thick fog. "This isn't personal," he continued, as if that made it any better. "You understand how important my career is. This is the next step, and I can't afford distractions right now." Distractions. Violet let out a breath, feeling the sting of those words but refusing to let them break her. "So that's what I was, a distraction?" "Come on, don't do this," he exhaled, frustrated now, as if she were being unreasonable for reacting at all. "We had a good run, but we both knew this wasn't forever." That was the moment something clicked. She had spent 3 years convincing herself that Ethan was the right choice because he was logical, because he was stable, because he didn't make her feel like she was losing herself. But standing there, in that dimly lit restaurant, she realized that stability wasn't the same as love, and she had never really had his. "All right," she said finally, her voice eerily calm. Ethan blinked, as if expecting more of a reaction. "That's it? What else is there to say?" she shrugged. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She didn't ask if he would change his mind, because for the first time in a long time, she saw things clearly. The next day, he left, and Violet walked away, carrying nothing of him with her. It was Austin who noticed first. A week had passed since Ethan was gone, and though Violet went about her days as usual, planning events, meeting deadlines, keeping busy, there was something in her silence that felt heavier than before. She wasn't sad, not in the way people expected, but she was empty. One evening, as she sat on the steps outside her apartment watching the city hum around her, Austin appeared, as if he had always known exactly when she needed him. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't tell her that she would be okay. Instead, he sat down beside her, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and for the first time since Ethan left, she didn't feel so alone. The seasons shifted, but Austin remained. He never rushed her, never made her feel like she owed him anything. He was just there, a quiet presence in her life, steady and unshaken, like the tide meeting the shore, never demanding, yet always returning. At first, Violet didn't know what to do with it. She had spent so long navigating relationships built on expectations, on the pressure to fit into someone else's plans. But with Austin, there was no script, no urgency, just time. They continued meeting, sometimes over coffee, sometimes during long walks through the city, when the air turned crisp and the leaves crunched beneath their feet. Austin never pried. He never asked if she had moved on from Ethan, if she was ready for something new. He let her find the answers herself. But the truth had been forming long before she was ready to admit it. It was in the way she sought him out without realizing it. The way she would catch herself texting him about something funny she had seen, as if his reaction mattered more than anyone else's. It was in the comfort of his silence, the way he never filled the space with unnecessary words. One evening, after an especially long day, Violet found herself on his doorstep. She didn't plan on coming. She had just walked, and somehow she had ended up here. Austin opened the door, and without hesitation, he stepped aside to let her in. She sat on his couch, curled up in one corner, watching as he poured her a glass of wine without asking if she wanted one. "You okay?" His voice was low, steady. She exhaled, watching the way the light flickered against the glass in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. Austin didn't push. He simply sat beside her, their shoulders almost touching, letting her exist in the moment without expectation. And that was when she knew. Not because of some grand realization, not because of a single defining moment, but because he had always been there. The weight of it settled in her chest, warm and certain. She turned to him, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Austin, do you know that you're the only one who's never left me?" His gaze met hers, unwavering, and then he smiled. "And I never will." There was no rush, no urgency, just understanding. This time there were no unspoken words left between them. This time they chose each other. The late afternoon sun bathed the park in golden light, stretching long shadows across the grass as laughter rang through the crisp autumn air. Violet watched from a distance, her heart swelling with something deeper than happiness, something that felt like home. Austin knelt on the ground a few feet away, a soft chuckle escaping his lips as Sophia, his daughter, his world, giggled uncontrollably. The little girl, barely 4 years old, had just managed to trap a butterfly between her small hands before releasing it again, her face glowing with delight. "Did you see that, Daddy?" Sophia beamed, her bright eyes reflecting the same warmth as her father's. "I saw," Austin grinned, gently tucking a stray curl behind her ear. It was in moments like this that Violet saw a side of him that no one else did. A man who had known loss, who had faced the weight of broken dreams, but had never let them harden him. A man who had learned how to love without fear. She had never tried to replace Sophia's mother. She never needed to. From the first time they met, she had made it clear she wasn't here to fill a role, but to love in her own way. And Sophia, in the innocent way children do, had simply accepted her. Not as a stepmother, not as someone forced into her life, but as Violet. Someone who painted pictures with her on rainy afternoons. Someone who braided her hair when Austin struggled to get it right. Someone who held her when she scraped her knee, whispering that she was brave. Love, she had learned, wasn't always defined by blood. It was presence. It was patience. It was showing up day after day, even when it wasn't required. And so she did. Things with Elena had not been easy. There had been tension, miscommunications, wounds that divorce had left behind. But Austin had worked at it. Not for himself, not even for Violet, but for Sophia. Over time, the walls lowered. Arguments turned into discussions. Bitterness gave way to an understanding that they both wanted what was best for their daughter. One afternoon, Elena had met Violet for coffee, the conversation polite but pointed. "I don't expect us to be friends," Elena had said, stirring her drink absent-mindedly. "But I do expect you to love her right." Violet had met her gaze without hesitation. "I already do." That had been enough. And now, months later, peace existed where there had once been uncertainty. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and violet, Sophia ran toward them, her tiny arms wrapping around Austin's legs before turning to Violet, her face bright with an unspoken request. Violet bent down, scooping her up effortlessly. "Let's watch the sunset, shall we?" Austin suggested, his voice gentle as he reached for Violet's hand. And she took it, without hesitation, without fear, without the weight of all the years lost between them. They stood there, together, as the last light of the day faded into the horizon. "Some love stories take years to be told," Violet murmured, leaning her head lightly against his shoulder. Austin pressed a soft kiss to her hair, smiling as he whispered back, "This was ours." Love was never just about finding the right person. It was about finding each other again. Despite everything, Violet and Austin had walked separate paths, carried by time, by choices, by all the things they never said. They had loved and lost in different ways, had built lives that never quite fit, had searched for something that was never truly gone. And in the end, love was not about the years they had missed, but about the way they found their way back. It was in the quiet moments, in the unspoken understanding, in the way being together never felt like a grand declaration, but a certainty they had both been missing. They were no longer the reckless hearts of their youth, no longer blinded by idealism or weighed down by regret. Instead, they were two people who had lived, who had been broken, and who had found healing in each other's presence. Love wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing someone despite it. And as they stood there, hand in hand, beneath a sky that had seen their love take shape and fade and return again, Violet finally understood. Some love stories take years to be told, but the ones that are meant to be will always find their way.